Before we can talk about the dinosaurs, we have to talk about the world they walked into, because the dinosaurs did not inherit a paradise. They inherited a wasteland, and to understand that wasteland, we have to go back even further. Back past the dinosaurs, back past the creatures that came before them, all the way back to the oldest chapter of complex life on Earth. Back to the sea. For the first 4 billion years of this planet's existence, life was almost entirely confined to water. The land, every continent, every mountain range, every river valley, was completely, absolutely, utterly barren. Not in the way that a desert is barren, where at least there are bacteria and wind-sculpted rock and the occasional adapted plant clinging to existence. Genuinely, completely barren. No moss, no lichen, no earthworms, no soil in any meaningful sense, just rock and dust and rain and more rock under a sky that had never heard a bird call and would not for hundreds of millions of years. The sea, however, was busy. For hundreds of millions of years, the oceans teemed with life of extraordinary variety and complexity. The early Paleozoic seas produced creatures that, if you could somehow go back and look at them, would seem alien beyond imagination. The trilobites, ancient arthropods with segmented bodies and compound eyes, dominated the seafloor for 270 million years. The sea scorpions, or eurypterids, some of them reaching 9 feet in length, were the apex predators of their time. Strange filter feeders and ambush predators and bottom dwellers and open water hunters filled every available ecological niche in a world where the entire biosphere was submarine. And then, roughly 500 million years ago, something appeared in that ocean that would change everything. Fish. Not the fish you know. Not the colorful, elegant, bony fish of modern reefs and rivers. Something older and stranger. The first fish had no jaws, only sucking mouths for filter feeding or scavenging. They were armored in heavy plates of bone, more like living tanks than anything we would recognize as a fish today. But they were vertebrates. They had backbones. And that spine, that simple structural innovation, was the foundation of an entire branch of life that would eventually produce frogs, crocodiles, pterodactyls, Tyrannosaurus rex, eagles, dolphins, and human beings. The age of fishes, as geologists call the Devonian period, lasting from around 419 to 359 million years ago, was when vertebrate life truly hit its stride in the sea. By this point, jaws had evolved, and jawed fish are a completely different proposition from jawless ones. A jaw is a weapon and a tool simultaneously. It lets you pursue and capture fast-moving prey. It lets you crush shellfish and crack bones. It opens up food sources that were previously inaccessible. The Devonian seas filled with sharks and armored fish and lungfish and the ancestors of all the land vertebrates that would ever live. And at the margins of those seas, something was beginning to happen that would set the stage for everything that followed. Life was creeping onto the land. The transition from sea to land is one of the most consequential events in the entire history of life, and it was not a single dramatic moment. It was a process, a slow, tentative, retreating, and advancing process that took tens of millions of years and involved a succession of creatures, each one slightly more capable of existing in the crushing dryness and alien physics of the aerial world than the one before. The first colonizers were plants. Before any animal set foot on land, plants had already established themselves in the moist fringes between sea and shore, developing woody tissue to hold themselves upright without the buoyancy of water, developing root systems to extract water from soil instead of absorbing it from all sides simultaneously. The evolution of wood is one of the most important events in Earth's history. Without it, there is no soil. Without soil, there is no terrestrial ecosystem. Without a terrestrial ecosystem, there are no land animals. The early land plants were followed by arthropods, centipedes and millipedes, early insects, creatures related to the ancient sea scorpions adapting to breathe air, becoming the first spiders, the first land scorpions. And then, in a moment that feels in retrospect like something that had to happen, the vertebrates began to follow. The key challenge for vertebrates leaving the water was breathing. Fish breathe with gills, organs that extract dissolved oxygen from water by passing water over a vast surface area of tissue. On land, there is no water to pass over the gills. They dry out and collapse. The vertebrates that made it onto land had to develop an entirely different system, the lung, a moist internal chamber where gas exchange could happen without exposure to the drying air. The creatures that pioneered this transition were the amphibians, animals like the great labyrinthodonts, some of them enormous by any standard, with bodies like those of giant newts and skulls that could reach a meter across. These were active predators in the swamps and lagoons and river deltas of the Carboniferous period, the age that followed the Devonian, roughly 359 to 290. The creatures that pioneered this transition were the amphibians, animals like the great labyrinthodonts, some of them enormous by any standard, with bodies like those of giant newts and skulls that could reach a meter across. These were active predators in the swamps and lagoons and river deltas of the Carboniferous period, the age that followed the Devonian, roughly 359 to 299 million years ago. The Carboniferous is the age of the coal swamps, and the name is literal. The vast swamp forests of this period, dominated by tree-sized club mosses and giant horsetails and enormous ferns, would eventually be compressed and transformed by hundreds of millions of years of heat and pressure into the coal seams that powered the Industrial Revolution and whose burning now drives climate change. There is something deeply strange about that connection. The energy that built the modern world came from sunlight that fell on a swamp 300 million years ago. In those swamps lived the most extraordinary insects the world has ever seen. The Carboniferous atmosphere was richer in oxygen than today's, and insects could grow much larger in a high oxygen environment. Dragonflies with wingspans of nearly 30 inches hunted through the swamp canopy. Millipedes 8 feet long moved through the leaf litter. The world was warm, wet, and strange, and the amphibians ruled it. But the amphibians had a fundamental limitation. They had to return to water to reproduce. Their eggs had no protective shell. They were laid in water, hatched in water, and the young went through an aquatic tadpole stage before developing the ability to breathe air. Every amphibian, no matter how perfectly adapted to land life in its adult form, was chained to the water's edge by its reproductive biology. What came next broke that chain. The egg, not just any egg, the amniotic egg, an egg with a self-contained fluid environment inside a protective membrane and often a hard or leathery shell. An egg that carries its own little ocean inside it, so the embryo developing within it never needs to be submerged in actual water. An egg that can be laid on dry land, on rock, in a burrow, in a nest, anywhere at all, and the embryo inside will still develop perfectly. The amniotic egg is one of the great biological inventions in the history of life. It is the key that unlocked the entire terrestrial world for vertebrates. Before it, every vertebrate land animal was a prisoner of the shoreline. After it, the whole continental interior became available. The creatures that evolved the amniotic egg were the reptiles, and the first reptiles appeared during the Carboniferous period, while the amphibians still dominated. They were small, lizard-like animals at first, not immediately impressive, nothing that would make you look twice if you saw one scurrying through the Carboniferous leaf litter. But they carried within their biology a revolution. Then came catastrophe. The Carboniferous gave way to the Permian, and the warm, moist, swampy world of the coal forests dried out. The climate became harsher, more continental, more variable. The great swamp forests retreated and then largely disappeared. And then, 252 million years ago, came the worst catastrophe in the history of animal life on this planet. The Permian-Triassic extinction event, the Great Dying, the event that killed approximately 96% of all marine species and 70% of all terrestrial vertebrate species. It makes the extinction that killed the dinosaurs look modest by comparison. The trigger was almost certainly a catastrophic episode of volcanic activity in what is now Siberia. the Siberian traps, where vast quantities of basalt poured out across an area comparable to the continental United States, releasing carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide on a scale that pushed global temperatures up dramatically, acidified the oceans, and depleted atmospheric oxygen to levels that were lethal for most of the complex life then existing. For millions of years after the Great Dying, the world was nearly empty. The few lineages that survived were the toughened, the adaptable, the lucky, and it was into this emptied, opportunity-rich world that, perhaps 15 million years after the extinction, the first dinosaurs walked. The first dinosaurs were not impressive. I want to be honest about that, because so much of the story of the dinosaurs but they had something the other animals around them did not. Their legs were held directly under their bodies, not splayed out to the sides the way a lizard's legs are. This upright columnar stance is far more efficient for sustained movement than the sprawling posture of a crocodile, which has to expend enormous muscular effort just to keep its body off the ground. The dinosaur's vertical legs meant it could move fast and keep moving fast, without exhausting itself. In 2025, a new discovery from the Triassic rocks of Argentina described a creature called Huayracursor, dated to around 228 million years ago, which appears to represent one of the earliest ancestors of the long-necked sauropod dinosaurs. Even at this early stage in their evolution, Huayracursor already showed a distinctly longer neck than other early dinosaurs, hinting at the extraordinary anatomical trajectory that would eventually produce Argentinosaurus and Patagotitan and the other true giants of the dinosaur world. The early Triassic world that the first dinosaurs inhabited was recovering slowly from the devastation of the Great Dying. The dinosaurs had to compete and carve out their niche against other archosaur lineages, but over the course of the Triassic, roughly 50 million years in length, the dinosaurs steadily expanded. By the end of the Triassic, they were beginning to dominate the terrestrial fauna. And when another extinction event struck at the end of the Triassic period, around 201 million years ago, wiping out many of their competitors, the dinosaurs emerged into the Jurassic world as the undisputed rulers of the land. The Jurassic period, stretching from about 201 million to 145 million years ago, was the high summer of dinosaur dominance. The climate was warm globally, warmer than today, with no polar ice caps and tropical or subtropical conditions extending to very high latitudes. Vast forests of cycads and conifers and tree ferns spread across the lowlands. And in those forests, on those plains, through those swamps, the dinosaurs diversified into an extraordinary variety of forms that we are still only beginning to fully understand. H.G. Wells, writing in 1922, notes that the vegetation of the Mesozoic era was dominated by cycads and conifers and ferns, without yet the flowering plants and grasses that we associate with landscapes today. No daisies, no oak trees, no grass prairies. The Jurassic world was green but strange, alien to our eyes, filled with plants that have no modern equivalents or survive today only in remote and isolated pockets of the world. Into this landscape came the sauropods. These are the animals that most completely break the human imagination's ability to scale. We intellectually accept that Diplodocus was 84 feet long, as Wells tells us. That Patagotitan miorum, described from fossil remains found in Argentina and believed to be the largest animal ever to walk the earth, may have weighed as much as 70 or 80 metric tons. 70 metric tons. That is roughly equivalent to 10 to 12 African elephants, a number so large it loses meaning. But the bones are real. You can go to the Museo Paleontologico Egidio Ferruglio in Trelew, Argentina, and stand in front of the mounted skeleton of Patagotitan and feel something happen in your brain as the scale of the animal refuses to be processed normally. The femur alone, the single thigh bone, is taller than a tall man. And these animals were alive. They breathed. They had hearts that somehow pumped blood up that impossible neck to a head 40 or 50 feet above the ground. They had young that hatched from eggs the size of footballs and grew into adults that weighed as much as a fleet of large trucks. The 2022 study by Jasmina Veman and colleagues at Caltech and the Field Museum, published in the journal Nature, offered a crucial piece of the answer to how they did it. Using a technique that analyzes oxidative stress compounds preserved in fossil bone to infer metabolic rate, the researchers found that the large sauropods had some of the highest metabolic rates of any dinosaur studied. Diplodocus, in particular, showed a metabolic rate comparable to modern birds, not sluggish, actively, powerfully, intensely warm-blooded, running a metabolism that demanded enormous caloric input and produced enormous energy output. This makes sense of the giant neck in a new way. A high metabolism animal of that size needs to eat almost continuously. The long neck allowed a brachiosaurus to sweep a vast arc of vegetation without moving its body, minimizing the energy expenditure of locomotion while maximizing the area it could feed from. The neck is not just impressive, it is a feeding machine. Around these giants swarmed the other dinosaurs of the Jurassic. Stegosaurus, according to the same metabolic study, was actually cold-blooded, its metabolic rate comparable to modern reptiles, which means it did not need to eat nearly as much as the sauropods, but it was also less active. The Stegosaurus baking in the Jurassic sun to warm its blood before it could move with any speed. The plates along its back may have served as solar panels and radiators simultaneously, and perhaps also as display structures. And hunting among the herbivores were the predators. Allosaurus, the dominant large predator of the North American Jurassic, a bipedal carnivore reaching perhaps 39 feet in length, with jaws that could open to an extraordinary gait. Not as famous as Tyrannosaurus rex, which came later, but in many ways a more elegant hunter. The seas of the Jurassic were filled with their own megafauna, ichthyosaurs, those dolphin-shaped marine reptiles that had completely readapted their bodies to life in the water, plesiosaurs, with their vast paddles and their extraordinary necks, the longest neck relative to body size of any animal that has ever lived, and above the trees, the pterosaurs filling the Jurassic skies. By the end of the Mesozoic, the pterosaur lineage had produced Quetzalcoatlus northropi, named after the Aztec feathered serpent god, with a wingspan estimated at between 35 and 40 feet. The wingspan of a small airplane, an animal that could look a giraffe in the eye while standing on the ground. The Jurassic gave way to the Cretaceous around 145 million years ago, and the Cretaceous brought one of the most important evolutionary developments since the first plants moved onto land: flowering plants. For the first 150 million years of the age of reptiles, there were no flowers anywhere on Earth. No flowering trees, no flowering shrubs, no grasses, no daisies, no orchids, no roses. And then, in the early Cretaceous, the angiosperms began their extraordinary diversification. By the mid-Cretaceous, they were spreading across the world. By the late Cretaceous, they dominated much of the terrestrial plant world, bringing with them an ecological revolution. Their flowers attracted insects for pollination, driving the coevolution of bees and butterflies and beetles in astonishing new directions. The dinosaurs of the Cretaceous diversified alongside these changes. The armored dinosaurs reached their peak. Ankylosaurs, with their bodies encased in bone and tail clubs of fused bone that could shatter a predator's legs with a single swing. And the ceratopsians, the horned dinosaurs, diversifying into an extraordinary variety of shapes. In June 2024, paleontologists from the Natural History Museum of Utah announced the discovery of Lokaceratops rangiformis, a new species of horned dinosaur found in the Badlands of northern Montana, dated to around 78 million years ago. Lokaceratops had two huge blade-like horns on the back of its frill, unlike anything seen in any other ceratopsian, and it was found alongside 4 other ceratopsian species in the same fossil assemblage. 5 different horned dinosaur species, living together, each slightly different, occupying slightly different ecological niches. That single discovery overturned the long-held assumption that a maximum of 2 horned dinosaur species could coexist at the same place and time. their extraordinary horn and frill diversity driven by the same forces that produce the elaborate horns and antlers of modern animals: sexual selection, the drive to attract mates and intimidate rivals. And towering over all of it, in the late Cretaceous of North America, was Tyrannosaurus rex. Tyrannosaurus rex. There is no more famous animal in the history of life on Earth. No other creature has so thoroughly captured the human imagination. Children around the world recognize it before they learn to read. Museums are built around individual specimens. Auction houses sell its bones for millions of dollars. H.G. Wells calls it the last word in reptilian frightfulness, and writing in 1922, he was not wrong to be impressed. But the Tyrannosaurus rex that Wells knew, the lumbering, tail-dragging, almost lizard-like giant that dominated early 20th century depictions, only vaguely resembles what the science of the past 30 years has revealed. The first and perhaps most important revision concerns the question of warm versus cold blood. For most of the 20th century, dinosaurs were generally assumed to be cold-blooded ectothermic animals. The image was of slow, sluggish creatures dependent on external heat, unable to sustain prolonged energetic activity. It was a view that made the dinosaurs seem, in some fundamental way, inferior to the mammals that replaced them. That view is now essentially dead. The 2022 study by Jasmina Veman and her colleagues at Caltech and the Field Museum, published in Nature, used a revolutionary technique. Instead of grinding fossils to dust, the researchers used Raman spectroscopy to analyze the molecular composition of fossil bone without destroying it. They looked for metabolic waste products, the chemical residue of the body's energy production process, preserved in the bone matrix. Tyrannosaurus rex was warm-blooded. So were the large sauropods. So were the feathered theropods. However, the study also found something humbling for any T-Rex enthusiast. It had the lowest metabolic rate of any of the carnivorous Saurischian dinosaurs studied. Warm-blooded, yes, but not the hyperactive, explosive, perpetually sprinting predator of the movies. More like, as lead researcher Veman described it, a sluggish scavenger more than an active pursuit predator. Powerful, dangerous beyond measure, but perhaps more patient and opportunistic than the movie version suggests. Then came the Nanotyrannus revelation. For decades, a bitter dispute had divided the paleontological community over a small tyrannosaur found in Montana and initially named Nanotyrannus lancensis in 1988. Most of the scientific community maintained that Nanotyrannus was simply a juvenile Tyrannosaurus rex. A minority insisted it was a distinct species in its own right. In 2025, the debate was definitively settled. Paleontologists Lindsay Zano and James Napoli published a study in Nature describing a complete Nanotyrannus specimen found as part of the legendary dueling dinosaurs fossil in Montana, preserved locked in combat with a Triceratops. The animal was nearly fully grown, but it was built completely differently from T-Rex in ways that cannot be explained by age. Longer hands, different skull proportions, a different body plan entirely. A slender, agile predator built for speed in a way that the massive T-Rex was not, that coexisted with T-Rex in the last million years before the extinction. The implication is staggering. We had been looking at Nanotyrannus fossils and assuming they were juvenile T-Rex for decades. Every study of T-Rex growth and development that used Nanotyrannus material was studying the wrong animal. And more broadly, the late Cretaceous of North America was not a world dominated by a single supreme predator, but a world of multiple coexisting tyrannosaur species, a richer and more complex predator community than anyone had imagined. We are still learning. That is worth sitting with. In 2025 alone, paleontologists described 44 new dinosaur species, nearly one per week. The rate of discovery is not slowing. It is accelerating. There is a sentence that tends to stop people cold when they first encounter it. Birds are dinosaurs, not evolved from dinosaurs, not the distant descendants of dinosaurs. Birds are, taxonomically and literally, a living group of dinosaurs. The clade Dinosauria includes all birds and all their non-avian relatives. When you watch a pigeon walk across a pavement, you are watching a dinosaur. When you eat a chicken, you are eating a dinosaur. The most diverse group of terrestrial vertebrates alive today, with roughly 10,000 species distributed on every continent including Antarctica, is the dinosaur group. H.G. Wells understood this to a degree. He describes how a group of small, hopping, dinosaur-type reptiles, pushed by competition and predation pressure toward cold and difficult environments, began to develop elongated, quill-like scales that eventually branched into the crude beginnings of feathers. He notes that feathers came before wings, as thermal insulation, before they were co-opted for flight. He describes the Archaeopteryx, the famous transitional fossil found in the Solnhofen limestone of Bavaria, which had the wings and feathers of a bird, but the teeth and long bony tail of a dinosaur. What he could not have known in 1922 was how explosively the fossil evidence would accumulate over the following century, particularly following the discovery in the 1990s of an astonishing series of feathered dinosaur fossils in the Yixian Formation of Liaoning Province in northeastern China. These fossils revealed that feathers were not a unique innovation of the bird lineage. Many species of theropod dinosaurs had feathers, or protofeathers, or filamentous structures that grade continuously into feathers without a clear boundary. Microraptor, a four-winged gliding dinosaur from the Yixian, had feathers on all four of its limbs. Utyrannus, a close relative of Tyrannosaurus from an earlier period, was covered in long, filamentous feathers. In 2025, a study published in the journal Royal Society Open Science examined fossilized skin impressions from Diplodocus and found microscopic evidence indicating these animals may have had colorful patterns on their skin. Not the drab gray or green of the old reconstructions, potentially vivid patterns, suggesting that visual communication through color was important in sauropod social life in ways that nobody had previously suspected. The birds that emerged from within the theropod group were simply one lineage among many, distinguished not by being the first to have feathers, but by the specific combination of feathers, wishbone, and flight that would eventually make them the most successful flying vertebrates in the history of the planet. And the birds survived. When everything else ended, the birds survived. While the dinosaurs ruled the surface world in all their spectacular variety, something else was happening in the margins. In the undergrowth, in the burrows, in the leaf litter, in the cracks and crevices of the Mesozoic world, the mammals were living out their own story. And it was a story, for most of the Mesozoic, of smallness, of hiding, of nocturnal caution, of surviving in the spaces the dinosaurs could not or would not fill. The first mammals appeared roughly around the same time as the first dinosaurs, in the Triassic period. They evolved from a different group of amniotes than the reptiles, from the therapsids, sometimes called mammal-like reptiles, a group that had been dominant before the Permian-Triassic extinction and that the Great Dying had devastated. The survivors were small, rat-sized or shrew-sized for the most part, warm-blooded, which meant fast metabolisms, meant the ability to be active at night when the environment was too cold for most reptiles. They were already growing hair, already nursing their young with milk, already developing the large brains relative to body size that would eventually distinguish the mammal lineage. But for 160 million years, the entire span of dinosaur dominance, they stayed small. Not because they could not evolve larger forms, but because the ecological space for large land animals was thoroughly and comprehensively occupied. Every large herbivore niche was filled by a dinosaur. Every large predator niche was filled by a theropod. H.G. Wells notes quietly that if you walk through a typical Mesozoic landscape, you might search for days without seeing a mammal, while pterodactyls flapped overhead and dinosaurs moved through the forest. The mammals were background characters in a story dominated by something else, hidden, cautious, effective in their limited way, but fundamentally constrained by the presence of the dinosaurs. And then the dinosaurs were gone, and everything changed. 66 million years ago, on what may have been an otherwise ordinary late Cretaceous afternoon, something arrived from the outer solar system. It was a rock, an ancient, dark, clay-rich rock formed at the very dawn of the solar system some 4.5 billion years earlier. It was roughly 10 to 15 kilometers across. It was traveling at perhaps 20 kilometers per second, and it hit the shallow sea of the Yucatan Peninsula in what is now Mexico, with a force that beggars any human analogy. The energy released by the Chicxulub impact was approximately equal to 1 billion of the largest nuclear weapons ever built detonated simultaneously. The rock vaporized instantly on contact, along with a vast quantity of the target rock. A fireball expanded outward at hypersonic speed. A tsunami of inconceivable height propagated outward across the Gulf of Mexico. Earthquakes of magnitude 10 or higher radiated outward through the crust in every direction. The ejecta, the vaporized rock and asteroid material hurled into the upper atmosphere and briefly into low Earth orbit by the force of the impact, rained back down globally over the following hours and days. Estimates suggest that the thermal pulse from returning ejecta was intense enough to ignite wildfires across vast areas of the globe. The sky, for a brief but catastrophic period, was literally on fire. And then came the darkness. In August of 2024, a study published in the journal Science by researchers at the University of Cologne confirmed, using ruthenium isotope analysis, what had long been suspected but never definitively proved. The Chicxulub impactor was a carbonaceous chondrite, a C-type asteroid originating from the outer solar system, beyond the orbit of Jupiter. As lead researcher Karsten Münker put it, the fate of the dinosaurs and many other species was sealed by a projectile from the outer reaches of the solar system, an interloper from beyond Jupiter, drifting inward over millions of years, until on one specific day, it arrived at Earth's orbit at the same moment that Earth was there to meet it. The dust and soot and sulfur aerosols thrown into the stratosphere by the impact and by the wildfires it ignited blocked sunlight globally. The planet's surface cooled. Photosynthesis essentially stopped. In January 2025, a study published in Nature Communications, led by Katarina Rodiuchkina at Luleå University of Technology, revised downward the previous estimates of sulfur release from the impact, suggesting that sulfur may have been a less important driver of extinction than previously thought. The larger share of the killing was done by the dust and soot alone, by the simple mechanism of blocking the sun long enough that the food chain collapsed from the bottom up. Plants died in the darkness. Herbivores that depended on plants died next. Carnivores that depended on herbivores died after that. The cascade of extinction moved through the food web with ruthless efficiency. The larger the animal, the more food it needed, and the less able it was to survive on reduced rations. A mouse could survive the impact winter on insects and stored fat. An Edmontosaurus could not. The global darkness lasted, based on current estimates, for somewhere between 1 and 2 years. 2 years without meaningful sunlight anywhere on Earth. 2 years in which most of the primary productivity on which virtually all complex animal life depends essentially ceased. By the time the skies began to clear, the world that emerged was unrecognizable. There is a site in North Dakota called Tanis, part of the Hell Creek Formation, that has yielded what may be the most extraordinary fossil preservation in the history of paleontology. The sedimentary layers at Tanis appear to record the events of the day of the Chicxulub impact in extraordinary detail, from the first minutes until a few hours after the strike. Amber from the site has been reported to contain glass microtectites, tiny spheres of glass formed by the heat of the impact, still intact inside their amber prison 66 million years later. Fish fossils at the site show evidence of death by asphyxiation on a massive scale, apparently killed by the surge of water displaced by the impact's seismic waves moving through river systems, thousands of miles from the strike point, within minutes of the impact itself. The aftermath was not simply one of extinction, it was also, in a profound and strange sense, a beginning. In April 2025, a study published in Nature Communications led by Honemi Sato at Kyushu University examined core samples drilled from within the Chicxulub crater itself, work building on a pioneering 2016 drilling expedition led by Sean Gulick at the University of Texas. The study found that the hydrothermal system created by the asteroid impact where the immense heat of the strike drove water circulation through the fractured rock of the crater, generated nutrient-rich conditions in the overlying ocean that may have sustained and accelerated the recovery of marine life at the impact site for at least 700,000 years after the event. The crater that destroyed most of the marine life in the Gulf of Mexico in the immediate aftermath of the impact became, within years, a hotbed of biological activity that helped drive the recovery of the ocean ecosystem. Death and new beginning, inseparable as always. Not everything died. Approximately 75% of all species on Earth went extinct at the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary, but 25% survived, and the pattern of survival is deeply instructive. The key variable appears to have been size and metabolic flexibility. Small animals that could reduce their metabolic demands during lean times, animals that could eat almost anything, including detritus and carrion and stored seeds, those animals had a chance. Large animals locked into specific food sources, animals that needed enormous quantities of food every day just to maintain their body temperature, those animals almost universally went extinct. The crocodilians survived, cold-blooded, able to reduce their metabolic requirements dramatically during lean times, going months without eating if necessary. A crocodile can survive the impact winter. A T-Rex cannot. The sea turtle survived. The frogs and salamanders survived. Small, cold-blooded, able to wait out the darkness in suspended states of minimal activity. And the birds survived, specifically because of something in their lineage that, at the time, may have seemed like a minor modification, but turned out to be of survival-critical importance. Modern birds molt their wing feathers in a specific pattern that allows them to maintain the ability to fly throughout the molt process, allowing them to search more widely for food than dinosaurs that would have been grounded during feather replacement. The birds that survived were small, ground foraging, flexible in their diet, capable of sustained flight, and metabolically efficient. The mammals also survived. The small, nocturnal, metabolically flexible, dietary generalists that had been living in the dinosaurs' shadow for 160 million years were exactly the right shape and size for the impact winter. They could eat insects, they could eat seeds, they could eat carrion, they could burrow underground and wait. The age of reptiles was over. The age of mammals was beginning. H.G. Wells ends his account of the age of reptiles with a beautiful piece of observation. He imagines a quasi-human intelligence watching the world through the 80 million years of dinosaur dominance and asks how safe and eternal it must have seemed. How assured the wallowing prosperity of the dinosaurs, the flapping abundance of the flying lizards. And then the mysterious rhythms and accumulating forces of the universe began to turn against that quasi-eternal stability. It is one of the most quietly devastating sentences in popular science writing, because it applies with equal force to any period of apparent stability. The Cretaceous world, warm and rich and diverse and seemingly permanent, was actually perched on the edge of an event that would end almost all of it within a human lifetime. The dinosaurs had no way of knowing. An asteroid from the outer solar system does not announce its arrival. There is an obvious and uncomfortable parallel to the present that I will leave largely unstated, except to note one thing. We, unlike the dinosaurs, do have the capacity to look up and see what is coming. We have telescopes, we have the mathematical understanding to calculate the orbits of potentially dangerous objects. NASA's DART mission in 2022 successfully altered the orbit of the small asteroid Dimorphos by deliberately impacting it with a spacecraft, demonstrating for the first time that asteroid deflection is not merely theoretical. We are the first species in the history of life on Earth to be capable, in principle, of preventing an extinction-level impact. The world that emerged after the Chicxulub impact was emptier than anything the planet had seen since the aftermath of the Great Dying. But it was not empty forever. Life has always filled the available space. Within 10 million years of the extinction, mammals had diversified into forms that filled virtually every major ecological role that the non-avian dinosaurs had vacated. Large herbivores, large predators, swimmers, climbers, burrowers, flyers, and one mammal lineage, small and arboreal, with large eyes and grasping hands and unusually large brains, made its home in the recovering forests. The primates, who we met in episode 1. The dinosaurs are gone, except for the birds that fill your trees and wake you each morning with their calls. But the world they built, the world they shaped over 160 million years of dominance, that world is the foundation of everything that came after. The flowering plants that the Cretaceous dinosaurs browsed under are the same flowering plants whose wood becomes your furniture and whose fruit fills your grocery store. The insects that co-evolved with those flowers pollinate the crops that feed you. The dinosaurs did not simply end, they transformed. Their story did not stop 66 million years ago. It continued in feathers and hollow bones and warm blood in every bird that has ever sung. In 2025, 44 new dinosaur species were described by scientists, nearly one per week. The rate of discovery is higher than it has ever been. Around 1,400 dinosaur species are now known from fossils found in more than 90 countries, and every paleontologist who studies them will tell you the same thing. We have almost certainly found only a fraction of the species that actually lived. The Mesozoic was long, 250 million years of reptile dominance. In that time, species evolved and flourished and went extinct over and over again in numbers that stagger the imagination. Most of them died without leaving any fossil record at all. A fossilized bone is an improbable thing, requiring a specific sequence of events: death in the right environment, rapid burial by sediment, mineralization over millions of years, survival of the resulting fossil through geological upheaval, erosion to the surface in a location where someone would eventually look, and then the attention of someone who knew what they were looking at. Every fossil we have is a miracle of improbable preservation. There are dinosaurs in rock formations that have never been excavated. There are dinosaurs in countries where paleontology is only now beginning to develop as a field. There are, almost certainly, dinosaurs of body forms and ecological roles and sizes that we have not yet imagined, because we have not yet found the fossils that would compel us to imagine them. The story is not finished. In crucial ways, it has barely begun. There is a stillness that follows the end of something very large. Imagine the world 66 million and 1 year ago. The Cretaceous at its height, the late afternoon sun of the Maastrichtian age falling on a world full of extraordinary life. A herd of Edmontosaurus, those great duck-billed dinosaurs, moving through a floodplain forest, the sound of their passage audible from miles away. A triceratops grazing in a clearing, its massive frill tilted slightly toward the sun. High overhead, the silhouette of a Quetzalcoatlus riding a thermal, that impossible wingspan catching the warm air, the animal's shadow moving across the treetops below it. In the undergrowth, a small nocturnal mammal, some ancestor of all the mammals that would ever live, cautiously testing the air with its nose. In the trees, the ancestors of modern birds, small and wary, sleeping through the day. A complete world, 66 million years of evolution producing this exact, specific, unrepeatable moment. And then the sky changes. A streak of light, brief and impossibly bright, visible for just a second on the southern horizon. Then the ground shudders and keeps shuddering, and the light in the south grows and grows and does not stop. We will never fully know what those last hours were like for the animals that lived through them. We can only read the rocks, and the rocks tell us what came after. The extinction layer, that thin band of iridium-rich clay that can be found in geological formations all over the world, from Denmark to New Zealand, from Antarctica to the Sahara, that marks the precise moment when the world changed. Below the layer, the Cretaceous, rich with its characteristic fossils. Above it, almost nothing for a while. And then, slowly, new life, different life. Smaller at first, more cautious, building tentatively in the emptied world. The lords of the earth departed. What they left behind was everything